Hi class, AREC 173, Plate Planet Society. So I'm picking up the second part of the first lecture on Module 3 on food in the local context. Just as a reminder, we just covered the right to food, and one of the challenges we have is how is the right to food interpreted, and what duty is implied by the right of people to have food. And we see that that's really interpreted in different ways in different countries with their food policies of how much there's sort of a sense of an obligation of government providing food or government helping provide the means for people to feed themselves. I'm going to share my screen with you and come back to this lecture. So part 2 of this lecture is going to be about food insecurity. Not sure why it won't show, but there we go. So we have this concept. So I'm going to start by talking about data which is collected here in Canada about food insecurity and how it's collected and how it also relates to the way that different countries also collect their data about food insecurity. Canada has a community health survey, which was implemented in 1998-99 for the first time, was then implemented every 2 years for the next kind of 4 cycles. It was done annually in 2008, 2009, 2010, 11, 12. And then in 2015, and I'm not sure about more recently, it uses the idea of a food insecurity experience scale. So this is what are people's experiences with food insecurity. This is the same scale which is used internationally for measuring progress against Sustainable Development Goal 2 of end hunger. The indicator 2.1.2 is the food insecurity experience scale. So these are questions which are robust across cultural context and can be translated into languages that people understand and then implemented in a whole variety of places around the world. There's another indicator that you often see for food insecurity, which is undernourishment. And so that's the prevalence or the proportion of people who at some particular time are undernourished as indicated by their caloric intake. And that is still the indicator we have the most long time frame for, and that's Sustainable Development Goal Indicator 2.1.1. So we've used 2 big indicators of food, one of which we use in Canada. We don't monitor the undernourishment indicator, the 2.1.1, but we do monitor the 2.1.2 indicator. And you can follow this STD tracker data to get more information about that. So these, I know this is a very small font here, but you can see the questions. So these are for people to respond as a often true, sometimes true, never true indicator. So they've got three levels, and we just add up these scores to come up with a food insecurity experience score. So I'll just go through the first couple. First statement: you and other household members worried that food would run out before you got money to buy more. Was that often true, sometimes true, or never true in the past 12 months? So looking retrospectively over the past 12 months, getting you to reflect upon the validity of that question. And so on to the last question, in the past 12 months, did any of the children ever not eat for a whole day because there wasn't enough money for food? Okay, so we score that across all of these questions, and then we have an indicator of the food insecurity experience. This is the data for Canada for 2007 to 2012. the number, so we've taken those scores and then allocated them to severe, moderate, and marginal food insecurity classes. And you can see the number of people who are severely food insecure was relatively constant over time. The number of people who report being moderately food insecure increased over that 5-year time period. And the number of people who indicated that they're marginally food insecure also increased slightly. So you had this increase from about 1.4 million households in Canada to something like 1.65 million households in Canada reporting being food insecure over a 5-year period, which is really quite striking to know that we have something like 1/10 of our population being food insecure. How did that break out across the provinces and territories? So we have an incredibly high rate of food insecurity, all 3 forms, severe, moderate, and marginal in Nunavut. So you can see Nunavut has something like 18.5% of its population being severely food insecure, and another 21% being moderately food insecure as of 2012. That's much higher than anywhere else. The next highest rates of food insecurity are the other territories, Northwest Territories and Yukon Territory. Yukon was just slightly more than Nova Scotia. So we have another cluster of somewhat higher food insecurity at that time in the Maritime provinces, and the area from Ontario to BC, sort of the lowest rates of food insecurity, but still surprisingly high, right? Still surprisingly over 10% rate of food insecurity of one form or the other in Canada. So that's the percentage terms. In terms of absolute numbers, the absolute numbers of food insecure households are in Ontario, Quebec, Alberta, and BC. We also are the provinces with the highest numbers of people. Valerie Turasuk, this is a really cool paper. Turasuk's been studying these data from the Canadian Community Health Survey ever since it started, and continues to do that analysis. One of the analysis she and colleagues have done are on the predictors, or things which are associated in general with high rates of food insecurity. So you can see, so this is how they've reported their data. So if we take the base case of Ontario and compare other provinces and territories to Ontario, which ones have the same prevalence roughly as Ontario, which have somewhat higher prevalence than Ontario, which have somewhat lower prevalence than Ontario. Same thing then with source of food of household income, taking the base case of wages to self-employment, compare them to others in terms of what has higher, what has lower, what has about the same. If we take education being a bachelor's degree or higher, are there higher, the same, or lower, and so on. So what we can see from that are the people who are affected most by high rates of food insecurity are people living in Nunavut, Northwest Territories, Nova Scotia, Alberta. Everything else equal, so this holds everything else constant, right? So it's a multivariate analysis. People who are living reliant on unemployment insurance and social assistance for their income, people who've not completed a bachelor's degree, female single parents, and people who are unattached, and renters. So if you are in one of these, if you're in multiple of these categories, then you're highly likely to be food insecure. Where people with significant lower prevalence are people who are reliant on senior income. Immigrants are significantly lower compared to the base case of Canadian born, which might surprise some. Rural people lower prevalence in urban people, which might also surprise people. Everything else constant. And one insight from this, just on that income, is how relatively reliable our seniors are with their income, that people who are on senior income tend to have lower prevalence of food insecurity. So I say back to economics. So we're thinking about relating that to, why might people be food insecure? What's the kind of the theory tell us? So we're thinking that, remember, the utilitarian model is we want to maximize our consumption from our happiness from consuming stuff subject to our budget constraint. The higher our income, the more everything else equal, the likelihood is we're consuming more and therefore happier and therefore less food insecure. But our budget also depends on the prices of food and the prices of other things. So prices of other things are really high that might make us more food insecure. Therefore, if we think about it, let's look at what might vary across Canada, for example. Our level of income and the stability of that income certainly varies from place to place. So we might be food secure most of the time, but then in a shock time be food insecure. The price of food, and often people who live in isolated places have to pay much higher levels, much higher prices for their food to account for their transport costs and uncertainties. What's the price of other things like our rent and our healthcare? The higher those other things are, the less food money we may have available to spend on food, and what's our things like our knowledge and our preferences. A really striking phenomena, we saw that Nunavut has something like 45% of people being food insecure. Here's a pretty quick story of why. So this is a comparison of prices of food in Nunavut in blue and prices of food, the Canadian average in pink. So something like whole white flour, 2.5 times higher in Nunavut than in the rest of Canada, and that sort of 2 to 3 times higher scale pretty much holds all across, with chicken being a little bit of a difference. You can see I have a price, a 4-liter jug of milk there being $10.39 in Nunavut. Here's something that I came across my Twitter a few days ago, which was this veggie platter, a $70 veggie platter in Nunavut that someone posted from going to the supermarket there. Compare that to a Costco veggie platter. So this is that Nunavut veggie platter on the left is about a pound compared to the 4 pounds veggie platter for $10 at a Costco. So this is at least 10 times higher for this veggie platter in Nunavut compared to a southern location. So it's no wonder that people have much higher prevalence of food insecurity. Terrasuk also looked at, so we think looking at the Canadian Community Health Survey, that food insecurity is that manifest in health problems, and certainly the answer is yes. If we look at places that have the highest rates of diabetes, for example, so these diabetes, one of the main main non-communicable diseases associated with poor diet. The others being heart disease and some types of cancers. So we have much higher, these red areas where we have much higher prevalence and where there's been of food insecurity. In northern Alberta, northern Saskatchewan, northern Manitoba, Northwest Territories, Nunavut, much higher rates of type 2 diabetes. What's causing that? So we just talked about a high price of food. In those places which are very sparsely populated, there might be quite a low population in the town or city. It may not be able to support more than one store, that store has a kind of a monopoly of people in that area and are able to charge higher prices and extract more rent from people. Another challenge of food insecurity in those environments is that the country food that people might be accustomed to as part of their customary diets that might be very healthy, things like caribou or birds or bird eggs or fish and berries, they might have reduced consumption of all of those, partly because some changes in the food of the animal populations and changes in migratory routes of things like the caribou. There have been tighter government restrictions on hunting, fishing, and trapping in many communities because of concerns for the populations of those animals or fish. People may have more sedentary lifestyles and be less able to hunt and gather and collect country food. Say jobs in the mining or government sectors may not allow them to get out for the hunts. Weakening of traditional food sharing networks, so the networks that used to, and still in many places do, share country food, especially things like caribou, among households within a community, and ineffective government programs to kind of pick up the slack. Government has responded to some extent in Canada to this precarious food insecurity problem in northern and remote communities. We don't have a Canadian equivalent to SNAP, the US Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. We have the Nutrition North Canada program, which subsidizes nutritious food, fairly relatively costly, about $100 million in the most recent data we have here. The amount that is subsidized varies by community. Alberta started a school nutrition program in 2016, serving the needs of about 30,000 food insecure students, with school authorities using the funding to support students with greatest need. So we have some small targeted programs, not matched up with the level of the problem, however. The response in Canada, this is my last slide, has been primarily a community response, much more than a government response, starting with food banks. So the first food bank in Canada was started in 1981 in our city here in Edmonton. At that time, some blip in the oil industry meant that there was sort of this idea of a short-term shortage. Right now, almost all the food banks in Canada see themselves as really permanent because the need seems to be permanent and recurrent. There are about 4,000 food banks in Canada, 500 of which are located at Canadian universities and colleges, including University of Alberta, and who many of you are going to be working with this year. Something like 800,000 Canadians using a food bank each month in 2018, probably significantly higher in 2020 with COVID. There's a large reliance on volunteers, and those food banks run as charities. They are obtaining their food in 3 different ways. One are donations of food by local residents. Another one, a much larger one, is donation of food from commercial grocery companies who are donating things, mostly non-perishable food that might be getting close to its best by date or discontinued lines of food. And also cash donations at this point, which are really valuable for food banks for them to purchase fresh perishable food. Now, some food banks are purchasing more than 50% of their food, so they're mostly getting donations of income, of cash, which they can then purchase food. An important thing to note is that food companies and charities are released of liability for the safety of donated food. So food companies are held liable for the safety of the food that they sell, but if they make donations of food in good faith to charities like food banks, then they're released of that liability. There's a whole variety of new programs which are put in place, have been put in place primarily local level in all around the world, including in Canada, for food harvesting programs. So harvesting of food from, say, the Shaw Conference Center, extra food from Shaw Conference Center, which they then flash freeze and make available to things like shelters. Harvesting of food, say, potatoes and other vegetables from southern Alberta, which may not be quite of this kind of the homogeneity of their look, to make it onto supermarket shelves, are now being harvested and used in things like the Nate kitchens. So that's what I wanted to say about kind of this big picture of Canada, about the food security and food policy situation. I'm going to stop sharing and close off this recording.